Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our fifth of 10 sessions on the very important matter of peace in our world, bearing in mind that next week is Peace Week and the UN designated Day of Peace on the equinox as world leaders are beginning to gather in New York for the 2024 General Assembly. Today, we're going to be looking at peace in relationship with anxiety and human well-being. I want to start in a rather oblique manner to address this issue with what has been fascinating people around the world. In Lebanon, as over the last several days, hundreds of pagers and walkie-talkies and other communication devices have literally exploded, killing upwards of 40 people and hundreds wounded. One of the people that was killed was a 9-year-old girl. And all of us have cell phones. And I think that, at least in my mind and the mind of many, made us wonder when and how could our cell phones blow up? Because most of us carry them very close on our bodies, in our pockets, in our purses. Some information has come out that I wanted to share with everyone because I think it explains a lot about the nature of our world. Turns out these pagers and cell phones were contracted with a Hungarian company called Bach Consulting, but it only has one employee. But in 2022, it had a contract. It received a contract for $725,000. And then again in 2023, it received a contract for $523,000 to make very specific custom design pagers. Well, there's no company in Hungary with one employee that's going to be doing that. And the people that investigate these matters have found out that it was actually a Taiwanese company. The pagers were built in Taiwan in a company with American management for a contract from the Israeli Secret Service. So that's the backstory of these pagers. If you expand out a few vectors, what you see happening and the reason why these pagers were exploded over the last several days in Lebanon by the Israelis in coordination with the Americans is that there is a strategic intent specifically by the Israelis to escalate the war against Hamas, which is turning out to be a military and political and moral catastrophe for the Israelis, to say nothing about the Palestinians that are experiencing genocide. But now the Israelis want to escalate in Lebanon. They want to escalate against Iran. They want to escalate against the Houthis and bring the Americans into regional war. The Israeli media has been pounding this theme since October 7th of 2023. The polls are showing that over 90% of the Israelis support what the government is doing in terms of its genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. It's escalating conflict in the West Bank. And now the recent polling is showing that fully 45% of the Israelis support all-out regional war against Lebanon, Iran, the Houthis, and on the West Bank and in Gaza. And the Israelis and the Americans have develop a strategy that specialists are calling contained escalation. This is what the Ukrainians and NATO and the Americans are doing in Ukraine. Escalating, escalating, escalating. But in a contained, piecemeal way. But what is happening globally, as Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University keeps saying, and John Mersheimer, the dean of international relations, we're getting closer and closer to nuclear war. With the White House just last month issuing a directive to the Pentagon to prepare for first strike nuclear attack against Russia and China and North Korea simultaneously. And next week, Peace Week, at the UN, apparently final decisions will be made about whether the United States will enable the Ukrainians to start with American, British, and French military personnel to attack deep inside Russia. I made the point yesterday that part of the reality that all of us are facing is the collapse of our epistemological categories of cognition. The moral, political assumptions by which we have been raised and governed are all in a state of collapse. Polling around the world shows that in virtually every country, stress levels, addiction levels, drug abuse levels, anxiety levels, depression levels are increasing, particularly among our young. So at every level, from social media to our politics, to our economics, to our ecology, and now strategically with this escalating move toward increased conflict in multiple regions around the world, the human race is being brought into a catharsis of anxiety about a future it not only no longer understands, but no longer has an adequate capacity to influence in a meaningful way. So how we talk about peace in our time without the foundational facts that everybody shares, which was the world as it used to be, is a challenge not only for human well-being, it's a challenge for human survival, because our political and economic elites have prioritized war and conflict rather than solving the most fundamental human challenges confronting all of humanity at this time. And how we, the people, given this complete abdication on the part of our governments to make wise decisions, is a question far deeper than whether we have a democracy or we do not. Far more profound than whether you're of one religious persuasion or another, and you pray to one God or another God for the salvation that seems to be receding. And therefore, the question of peace and how we attain peace is the most urgent national security imperative any of us can contemplate. Because the pathway to that happy state has been so eroded. There is no longer an observable yellow brick road. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in today on these very weighty matters. The news is hard to bear. Peace seems more present as a yearning, but more elusive as a reality in our extremely conflicted world. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Eddington, who is the convener with Marilyn King, and they will introduce our guest, and we'll have our discussion, and then I'll circle back toward the end. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And as always, thanks for your opening comments. I'd like to pick up on your last point about the elusive nature of peace. And it's going to be the focus of much of our conversation today, because it speaks to the three levels of, and for those of you who are familiar with some of my work, Dr. Michael Nagler and I released the film The Third Harmony in the fall of 2020, where we talked about the three harmonies. The first harmony being harmony with nature, the second harmony being the harmony with others, and the third is the harmony within ourselves. And part of what we're going to be speaking to today is that inner harmony that helps shift our worldview, that helps shift how we see the world, that helps us understand that while all of those things that Jim was describing are true, it's also true that well over the 7 billion of the 8 billion people on the planet live in some version of peace every day. And it's our ability or inability to hold or not hold those truths that the reality is we're living in peace. And we do live in peace most of our life. And it's a function of how we see the world. It's how we see reality. And to your comments, Jim, yes, there is a distortion if we allow the news to overtake how we see the world, how we engage the world. And it doesn't in any way diminish the meta crisis that we're facing as a species, and the meaning crisis that most people on the planet are facing. And so we're going to be talking today about how to deal with the fear, how to deal with the anxiety, how to have a healthy state and healthy relationships with ourselves and with others in the uncertainty of the world. And I'll just make a quick plug for in a couple of weeks, we're going to be doing a program on the future of God, where we'll be speaking to the role that spirituality plays in helping us make sense of the meta and meaning crisis. And after next week's programming on peace, we'll have a week-long program on forgiveness, which has a fundamental role to play in helping us have a peaceful coexistence. But I'll stop there and introduce my dear friend, Marilyn King. Welcome, Marilyn. Delighted to be on this 2-week journey with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Newly anointed Dr. Tom Eddington. Yeah, I am, as usual, just really very, very delighted. And I want to remind people that we have kind of given the title of these 2 weeks, When Peace Was a Secret. And to Jim's point, most of what we are inundated creates pretty high anxiety when we watch the news. And so our efforts this year were to just do the very beginning of creating a report card so that as we go into the future, that we shift from when peace was a secret to when peace is no longer a secret. And if you put up the peace wheel, Tom, just as a reminder to people, we are using a peace literacy tool that was created by Pathways to Peace. And it's based on the many, many global summits that were convened at the United Nations on the rights of the child, the rights of the environment, and so forth, and was a way to be able to take a look at and come to understand the underpinnings of peace. And so it's not important to be able to read the elements of the peace wheel, but certainly available on the Pathways to Peace website. So I want to begin with just very brief remarks before I introduce Dr. Todd Pressman, who's with us here today. And I want to begin by just, I don't need to remind most of the people who are here on our call that tomorrow is the International Day of Peace. And as a just quick backdrop for those of you who might not know some of the nuances about the creation of the International Day of Peace, it was really a vision of Avon Madison's from childhood to have such a day. And in 1981, it was unprecedented, the only thing the United Nations has ever unanimously declared, that there would come into existence the International Day of Peace. And my own relationship to this day, there's the backstory that comes from having been in the Olympic Village with people of every race and religion, and believing that we could see peace in my lifetime if people thought about peace the way we thought about gold medals. In 1984, right here in San Francisco, across the bay from where I am, I participated in the first global celebration of the International Day of Peace. And 40 years later, we're doing the same thing. We'll be live streaming and connecting with cities around the world tomorrow on the International Day of Peace. But the second thing that's important and is related to what we're doing here in these 2 weeks is that through Pathways to Peace, this peace literacy tool was created. And what we also get to do going forward after this 40th anniversary is to up-level so that people know that peace is no longer a secret, and we can look through these 8 lenses. And through this report card, our intention is people can see the history of the success in these 8 areas, that they can see where we are in these 8 areas. And our intention is then to bring forward through our experts in the years going forward, how can we be involved in systemic change in any one of or all of these 8 areas? So that's the second part. And the third part is tomorrow at noontime, I get to stand on that stage and make visible the peace wave, because there are people every day who stop at noontime and they do what Olympians do. We take a breath, exhale, eliminate outside distractions, and we focus on our highest aspirations. So tomorrow, I will be helping to make visible to all of the people who are connected. And unlike 1984, when we couldn't see each other through technology, we now know there are over 3 billion people who know about Peace Day, and many of them will be involved with us. So tomorrow's a very exciting day. We get to elevate Peace Day through our work that we're doing going forward year after year here. Making sure that peace is no longer a secret, and showing people how you can increase the peace every day, participating in the peace wave. So today I am very excited. Our focus is on health, and in the peace wheel, each of those elements is described in a particular way, and I'm going to read it from the Pathways to Peace. That what the goal is in terms of health is it's envisioning a world where all people have food, shelter, and access to medical care, and children are born into and raised by healthy families and communities. So it's my pleasure to introduce a new friend of mine, Dr. Todd Pressman. And while we don't know each other well, we had just the most delightful conversation that made it really clear he's the perfect person to be with us today. He's a psychologist, and we know that there are many, many kinds of psychologists, but he's particularly well known for his work and his book, Deconstructing Anxiety. And what part of how he and I connected so clearly is because his focus is human potential. and that he has had an incredible history focused on healing traditions and exposure to many healing traditions, whether it's Zen, having had access to shamans, Zoroastrian teachings. A couple of people I relate to. He's had the privilege to be influenced by Stan Grof and a colleague of mine, Stanley Krippner. But where I really grounded with him in particular was he uses the metaphor of Michelangelo and the way he thought about art and making a statue, which is that you chip away what doesn't belong and you reveal the statue within. And so for me, when he talked about purpose and fulfillment, it's like, wow, this is exactly what I talk about in terms of Olympian thinking. I know that there's an Olympian in each and every one of us. And when we align body, mind, and spirit, that Olympian has a chance to see the light of day and express itself in the world. So, Todd, please, if you would join us. And there's no way that I could do justice to what you bring to this party. So if you would begin by sharing with us what you would like people to know that you bring to this conversation about health and well-being.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Tom. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I just want to start with how appreciative and grateful and admiring I am of this ultra important effort you're doing with the Pathways to Peace. Yeah, good question. Good way to start. What I'd like to bring to the conversation is the understanding that, just as Michelangelo said, and I love your reframe of it in terms of Olympians, when we release the statue in the stone or the Olympian that's in hiding, it's by virtue of getting the fear out of the way. So in the Deconstructing Anxiety model, we're talking about fear as the single obstruction to who we really are. And that authentic self is a spiritual self, a holistic self, something that participates in a much grander sense of oneness, you might say, where we recognize the common humanity of everybody. And fear, really is the culprit in the Deconstructing Anxiety work. We can deconstruct any problem at all, any source of suffering in the individual, in the collective, as a humanity, as a nation, what have you, down to a single core fear, we call it. A single source, a thought system that once understood gives us that chance to chip away the obstructions and reveal the statue within. So that's sort of the essence of my work in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'd like to take a big step back, because when I think about humanity, we're hardwired for collaboration and cooperation. We're hardwired and completely dependent upon each other, unlike other mammals that can be self-sufficient fairly early after birth. Human beings need the support of their mothers, their family, society at large. So we're hardwired for collaboration and cooperation. We've been living with this narrative of us being a violent species, and that combination of that narrative and the fear that you're speaking to seem to play off of each other. And I'm wondering what we can do to chip away and release that statue in by changing the narrative, by letting go of the fear.
Yeah, well, wonderful framing of the question, and it really evokes my enthusiasm for the topic, because yes, hardwired for collaboration, hardwired to connect in love and harmony. And yet we see so much evidence to the contrary. And what a powerful opening Jim made today that seems to present a picture that we are not hardwired for goodwill. When we understand that there is fear underneath the struggle and suffering and conflict in the world, and we get insight into the precise fear, literally a single thought, then we can target that problem, resolve the anxiety, and there are certain basic principles and specific exercises for doing that. And again, get the obstruction out of the way. There's nothing remaining to create conflict once the fear is resolved, there is that natural goodwill and cooperation that comes out spontaneously.
Can you speak to the principles and the practices?
Sure. So the principles are, I'll start in a very traditional, classic psychological way. Exposure therapy says that if we expose ourselves to a fear, we discover that there's no there. There was a very interesting and important study done in 2020 that took a bunch of people with generalized anxiety disorder. You could say we all have a degree of that, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a clinical diagnosis. Asked them very simply to write down their list of worries. Came back a month later and said how many of these came true. A whopping 91.6% of the things we are worrying about, that's the same as being afraid of, just don't come true. They never happen. And there was a pilot study before that that said essentially the other 8.4% of the time, yes, there's a problem that we experience, something akin to what we were anticipating, but it's experienced in a much more normalized way, something to simply deal with in the present moment where fear is always about the future. And we can deal with it. We've dealt with much more difficult things, so that can't even be called a fear anymore. If we can understand, here's the basic principle, that fear never plays out as a true threat. Bring ourselves out of that future anticipation of horror, terror, catastrophe, back into the present moment where we're simply dealing with what's in front of us and dealing with it capably. Now we talk about that in cooperation with other people where we're all doing that together. We have a real solution for what ails us. The practices are simply different forms of exposure therapy. Face the fear. It's actually a little bit more sophisticated than that. You can't just face any fear, and you can't just face it in any way. Find the right fear, targeting this core fear we're talking about. Face it in the right way so that you have a true exposure to it, one that feels safe, it's not going to trigger more anxiety, more fear, and discover that it isn't real. There's no way to continue to believe in the fear after you've lived through it, even if it's just in imagination, safely in imagination, and discover it can't do anything to you. So there's the basic principle and some practice that comes out of it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering, over the last couple of years, we've been getting a lot of attention has been placed on Gabor Mate and his work around trauma, and certainly others in the trauma field. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that intersection of trauma and fear.
Yeah, well, it's all the rage in my field, trauma everywhere, the neurobiology of trauma and so forth. And that's great. It's better than great. Anything that raises awareness is essential for healing and for growth as an individual and as a planet. My take on it is a little bit different, perhaps, than a lot of my colleagues. I think that the way they're conceiving of trauma these days, and they call it, there are big T traumas for the really significant ones, little T traumas for the little everyday things, some of which are like micro traumas you don't even notice because they're so much a part of the background. It simply becomes another word for fear in a fear response in my lexicon. So I think that what they're describing is sort of a circuitous way of discovering, yep, fear is that single source of what ails us. So great that they're raising awareness about it. It gets a little confusing in my book if we're not just seeing it as kind of a ubiquitous fear.
So speaking about that, how do we make the distinction between the amygdala doing its job to tell us to be afraid, and our prefrontal cortex that reminds us that these are things that we don't need to be afraid of?
Yeah, what a wonderful question, and I'm so glad Marilyn's here. You'll see why I say that. I appreciate that the amygdala has served its function. And if we take it out of a physiological metaphor and talk about how fear came to be adaptive in the evolution of humanity, of course, the answer is because it keeps us on our toes. It keeps us alert to danger. It's protective in that way. My complaint is that it comes at such a cost. And when you add the prefrontal cortex to it, where we can anticipate fear, then we're anticipating it right, left, up and down and everywhere in a way that certainly hurts us, doesn't help us. So here's where I want your support, Marilyn. I use this analogy in my speaking anyhow. A coach for an Olympic athlete can use a strategy of fear, hurting the athlete or incentivizing the athlete to try and do better by imagining, all the scary things that could come if they don't win that medal. And they use an approach of, that was a horrible performance. You stink, you're terrible, you're never going to get up on the podium. It can motivate an athlete for sure. And at the same time, the other coach that says, just visualize how delicious that feeling is going to be on the podium with the gold medal around your neck, and how you're going to have expressed your potential and set an example for the world and inspired thousands and millions of people. That's just as motivating without the harmful effect of fear, which creates tension in the body. I actually had a chance to share with Marilyn that my father, who was a psychoanalyst, taught by students of Freud, did some of the first work in sports psychology. And he brought hypnosis to the picture, helping athletes, especially figure skaters. I was a competitive figure skater myself, to visualize the perfect performance and feel the joy of that as the motivation for getting out on the ice and creating that ideal performance. There's no question that motivation through fulfillment, I call it, is much more effective than motivation through fear. So yeah, the amygdala came into the picture, creating this fear response, and it worked. It was probably a lot more necessary back in prehistoric times when there was a lot more to be afraid of. But here we're still carrying that response, holding the tension inside because of all the socialization, the civilization that causes this repression. And it just backfires. That strategy of producing good, it backfires mightily. It does not help us where motivation can.
Yeah, Todd, I would love to pick up on that because it can be a little intimidating being here with two doctors. I'm not, a doctor of psychology or philosophy or any of this, but I come from a very practical place of training in 5 events, at the highest level. And you probably know the work. I don't recall the name. It's Bandler and Grindler had this framework that said, people are either toward or away from as motivation. I come to believe that we're actually both. This is very attractive and we're motivated by this. We're also motivated by the not, having this. But what I wanted to share with you that, is a little intimidating because I'm not a psychologist. I don't know if you know the story, but in training for my 3rd Olympic team, my car was hit from behind by a truck. And I wound up with a debilitating injury that was misdiagnosed. But it allowed me to keep thinking, I'm going to be in the top 3 at the Olympic trials and I'm getting better every day. And there was no physical evidence for that change. And after weeks and weeks, I started to think, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to be training 6 to 8 hours a day. There's younger, faster, more talented women, right, who are training for the Olympic trials and the Olympic Games. And, I can't even hop from foot to foot. So the fear would come up. And once I discovered Olympian thinking, the framework, and started teaching Olympian thinking, people would say, well, what did you do with the fear? Well, there weren't sports psychologists back then. There were only 3. By 1980, there were only 3 sports psychology programs in the entire country. But I thought back to, what did I do? And it's like, oh, well, nobody taught me this, but when that idea would come up, it's like, oh my gosh, these younger, faster, more talented athletes. It literally, like it was a thought that came up on my left shoulder, like a little voice in my left ear. And I would literally take my finger and flick it. Because as soon as it popped up as a thought, I knew that that wasn't a good idea. Flick it. And I would take a breath and go, I'll be in the top 3 at the Olympic trials, and I'm getting better every day. And then I would figure out what I could do, whether it was watching films or standing on the track. And when we fast forward, I placed second at the Olympic trials without physical training for 7 months because of not something I was taught, but something that came through me as a strategy. And to your point, I think that what I learned through business consulting, the scenario planning framework, which when that fear comes up, some of them are very real. And what I learned in terms of the business domain is that you look at the full range of scenarios. This is the worst thing that could happen. This is what I'm wanting to happen. There are a lot of scenarios in between. And what I also shared with people, again, not being a psychologist, and people would ask me the question, I said, well, then what I would do is ask yourself when the fear comes up, what's the worst thing that could happen? Not just blah, blah, what's the worst thing that could happen? Oh, well, I guess I could be walking to the stadium and twist my ankle and not even be able to get to be in the Olympic trials. And then the important thing in my sharing was then you ask people to answer the question, what would I do? And well, I wouldn't die from that. I'd probably get a job at McDonald's and decide if I was going to train for the next Olympic team 4 more years. So my point here is when the fear comes up, what I shared with people is flick it, replace it, right? But you have to have done a worst case scenario so that if that were to happen, what would I do? That allows you to set it aside because the likelihood of that is so improbable that I can go back to being focused on this. So as a non-psychologist, that was me, flick, worst case scenario, and go back and focus on the toward.
Thank you. I really appreciate that and I see some of the comments in the chat room. You're sharing from your experience, which is always the most helpful kind of share. I would add that there are certain fears where we can flick them away with that awareness, just a simple awareness that who we are is bigger than the fear. Fear makes us feel very small and vulnerable in the face of it. It's big and powerful. When we can reverse that and feel big and powerful over the fear, it's very helpful. Then there are other fears which just have their clutches in us at some deep, deep level. And we still use the same strategy because essentially you described an exposure to the fear. You have to visualize the worst case scenario. And in that moment, there's an assessment that goes on. Can I be bigger than this? Can I remember my goal to win that gold medal or something like that? And say, I'm bigger than it. It's just a little thing to flick off. When the fear has us in its clutches, and that's the result of not only the amygdala's contribution, but a lifetime of learning reinforced by everyone outside of us who's also using fear as a strategy for accomplishing our fulfillment. When it's got its roots in us really deeply, then we just need to target what the source of those deep roots are. And when we can see that, create an effective exposure to that, have that confrontation safely in imagination, discover what it's really composed of, look at it and say, no, you cannot hurt me. Then we can put it on our shoulder and flick it off. We have to do that courageous work of looking at the fear wholeheartedly, staring it in the face, shaking hands with it, as my father would say, to discover, yeah, it doesn't work to push it away, repress, deny, do any kind of defensive maneuver. That's what backfires. That's what strengthens the fear. So we bring it in, courageously look at it, trusting that 91.6% of the time it's totally made up, 8.4% of the time it's something we can deal with and manage. Then we can have a healthy perspective on its ability or lack of ability to really do us harm.
Well, Todd, I'm really thrilled, if you don't mind, just to build on that for a moment, because I can't help but think about this 2 weeks that we're using. because we are inundated with the fear images that come from everywhere all around us right now about the world. And we can't really see the peace that is because we're consumed by that fear. And thereby, this strategy, you use the word strategy, I see this 2 weeks where we're looking through 8 lenses so that we can actually see the peace that is. It's like, oh, that's not everywhere, right? Those are very important things to address. We can see the history of the peace that has always existed. We can see where the peace exists and where those fears are not at play in this moment. But we can also assist people in the strategy about knowing what are the strategic, strategies for accelerating, good governance, the increase in health, ways to increase the peace through, media and through these 8 lenses. So really important in terms of this 2 weeks that we're doing right now, to be able to see the peace that is and to see strategies for going forward as a way to address the constant fear that comes from the messages that we're getting. So just thank you. This is really, for me, very helpful.
Beautifully said. And just to add a PS to what Jim introduced at the beginning, which was, again, so powerful. I love what you said, Marilyn, because, again, that lens of fear through which we look at world events can either contribute to the problem or help resolve it. One of my favorite quotes is by Michel de Montaigne. He said, "My life was filled with terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened." Right? So that's looking through the lens of fear, creating a distorted picture of what's actually going on out there. And think again about what Jim said. When we resolve that distortion, we can be so much more effective in resolving conflict and fostering peace.
I'd like to build on this conversation and some of your personal journey, Todd, to talk about at least my worldview that as a human being, I'm a spiritual being having a human existence, and talk about the role of our spiritual beliefs, our spiritual practices, and how they help us navigate our life, navigate the world, and how that shapes and influences our fears.
Marilyn said you were good at interviews. These are wonderful questions because they speak to give me a chance to speak to what I love most. In the framework I come from, and Deconstructing Anxiety is presenting, which is very akin to really essentially the perennial philosophy that you find in all world religions, all spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions. We start out with the idea that we were and still are participating in an experience of oneness. It's a bit of an awkward word. They call it now the non-dual experience. I think that's even more awkward. The idea is that there's no separation, and that our original state, which is still going on despite the distorting lens that makes things look very much separate, the original state is about this oneness. We all are joined together. It's a universal mind with a complete, absolute understanding that your good is my good. When I take care of you, I'm taken care of, vice versa. There's no opportunity for fear in that picture, because fear, a nice definition of it, is that we're separate from something we need and afraid we won't get it. And think about the implications of that. Well, let me lay it out this way. So we start out in this original state of oneness. In my Deconstructing Anxiety work, we talk about the creation story revisited. That is our original state. Then, and you see this in all of the creation stories from around the world, there's this description of a separation, a breach, a sort of rent in the oneness. And in the Big Bang, right, there's a creation story where everything is contained in this original seed, oneness. And this big explosion where you see the world of multiplicity, many, many separate parts. Time and space wouldn't exist in oneness, because I like to think of time as fear laid out sequentially, and space is fear laid out in 3 dimensions. In other words, I'm over here at this point in time and space. Something I need that I'm separate from is over there at that point in time and space. I have to move from here to there. It's what we call the journey to fulfillment. And all kinds of scary things could sabotage my purposes. When we resolve the fear, we resolve the distortion that we're separate. Discover again, we're still participating in this experience of oneness, and your good is my good and my good is your good. So there's a natural, spontaneous altruism that comes from that. There's a recognition that if I judge you, then I am misperceiving you as someone other, right? Rather than we're in this boat together, and what implications there are for our world condition, right? In terms of how we can get out of this mess and back to something that you all are working on so beautifully here.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wasn't expecting you to talk about oneness. I was anticipating you talking about being reconnected to our spiritual core, and then the outside externalities of the world would be diminished by seeing the world in a bigger way. And I really appreciate you speaking to the oneness dimension, because that's essential to.
Yeah, it's not different though than the other, what you expected. That this is why I saw someone again in the chat room appreciate somebody, I think Marilyn, offering a practical solution. This is why we have to make it practical. We can have all the best philosophy in the world. If we don't know how to apply it and make a difference in life as we live it, what's the use of it? So when we recognize that fear is the only thing getting in the way of that original experience of oneness, and we do the psychological, spiritual work on resolving fear, it's just a matter, again, of removing that distorting lens and seeing that already there's the potential latent waiting to manifest of this oneness experience where problems are resolved.
So I have to laugh here. Again, I'm with these 2 Ph.D. doctors, right? Then here's the one I had to perform in 5 events, right, at the Olympic level. And what did I do from a practical standpoint, which is what all Olympians do. And there are these concepts that, all come back to the one truth. And, I'm so practical and pragmatic. And so for me, it comes back to that in just one breath, you can shift. I call it speed shifting, right? I'm about to jump and, things are going on over there and my mind is doing some things about my outfit or whatever it might be. But in one breath, I can eliminate those outside distractions and the thoughts, which are usually, are often less than, right? But I take that long, slow, deep breath in and exhale. And at the bottom of the breath, there it is. You call it what you want. Call it what works for you. But there it is.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, when you don't train for 7 months in 5 events and you dare to show up at the Olympic trials, that wasn't me. Marilyn, my physical body was not capable. But in one breath, I exhaled. And yes, I had trained. I had imagined over and over and over again what it was I was intending. But I couldn't make that happen. That was something grander than me. That was something bigger than me. That was, when you talk about spiritual traditions and different ways of talking about oneness, and that's what the Peace Wave is at noontime tomorrow. There are people from many places live streaming in and out, and we have one moment when all together, we're going to take that one deep breath in, eliminate all those outside distractions and all that craziness in our mind, and find that one place of oneness that we are when we are not distracted.
It's inspiring me to think about an aspect of this work where we recognize I call it the nexus point, the place where mind, body, and spirit converge as an almost physical or partially physical location that you feel as a tension that's contracted in fear and an expansion and a release with the spirit, with the resolution of fear into spirit. And that's what happens when we take a deep breath. That kind of wonderful sigh, right? That says, ah, my tension melts away, is because this contraction of self from fear is dissolved in that moment. And it does open up a shift in thoughts and an expansion of the spirit as well as a release in the body. So imagine how many people are tomorrow, 3 billion, taking this deep breath, all having a glimpse of freedom from fear for a moment at the same time. Wow. Wow. The effects of that.
And two things. One, our intention is that the peace wave then lives, that peace day is every day, and that you can do this in one breath, and a way for us to be able to see one another. But my question, I want to come back to you because I would love to hear you talk just a little more about what actually happens in that one breath. When I eliminate those distractions, quiet this mind, and I find that it feels to me like it's empty there, but there's something that happens physiologically and biochemically and in the brain in that one moment. What is it? If you wouldn't mind just talking a little more about that.
Sure. If we blow up this nexus point under a microscope, which is really what any good meditative practice is trying to do, we enter into the very, very center of it, penetrate it through and through. Then we see, again, it's a confluence of mind, body, and spirit. The body has contracted in the fear state, that in a way that simply says, right, I've got to brace, defend myself, get ready to fight against what I'm afraid of. The thoughts have harnessed and honed their attention upon the threat. This very narrow focus, very small, isolated, separated focus on the problem. And the spirit as well has contracted to bring all of its awareness to the problem. Like you were saying, Tom, with the amygdala's function, it's supposed to help create safety. I'm going to be extra alert. All of my resources are attending to the problem so that I won't be taken by surprise. I'll be ready for fighting. It's a faulty strategy compared to the strategy of fulfillment, which says I can remove that whole distorted idea of fear, start with this assumption of our oneness and so forth, that your good is my good and vice versa. And then there's no need to imagine this person is a foe and get into the whole never-ending cycle of defense and attack, right? Take the Middle East, for example, never ends. So to answer your question, Marilyn, if we really zero in, like under a microscope, at that conjunction or convergence of mind, body, and spirit, what's happening there, we'll see, and you can start with any of the three of them. We call it the 3 doorways to healing. If you resolve any one of them completely, the other 2 automatically resolve. And so, for instance, we'll start with the doorway of the body. Maybe you do some Gestalt therapy, pound out your frustration on a pillow or scream it out or whatever kind of dramatic expression of the physical tension in that nexus point. There's no more energy there. It's all expressed. And there's this feeling that's accompanied by a shift in thought and an expansion of the spirit. That's what goes on with that breath. If you take the doorway of the mind, I'm penetrating that tension and understanding the thought at the source of it. That's that core fear we're talking about. Bringing it to the light, raising it to awareness, doing some kind of exposure work to it, and discovering it's not real. Once again, the bottom drops out, the constricting forces that create the tension disappear, and the thoughts resolve, the spirit expands, and the body releases as well. Take the doorway of the spirit, you're automatically seeing from this elevated view, recognizing our oneness, filled with the love that comes from that. You can't buy into fear when you're filled with love, right? I could go on, but that's a quick overview.
Well, and I'd like to just, there's a phrase, I have an Olympian colleague, Eddie Hart, the world's fastest human, and his story is a really great teaching story. Together, we're starting to do corporate presentations, and one of the frames we use is airtime. And Eddie had the aha that he could be the world's fastest human, and every single day that was his focus, and everything had to line up with that. And he could see things that didn't and things that did and adjust himself accordingly. And so the notion of airtime, encouraging people to take a look and just notice. And I use, my phone, and it chimes on the hour, and I do a review preview. In the previous hour, if we go back to my sports experience, how much time did I spend thinking about the other athletes and what they were doing and what I couldn't do? That's not what I did. Like, I'll be in the top 3 at the Olympic trials. I'm getting better every day. This is not helpful, but, I could do this. So I spent most of my airtime focused on my highest aspiration. And whenever something came up that wasn't contributing to that, I had a strategy for doing it. So just that notion of being able to enter into any of those 3 ways, and what it actually does, I'm using my body to take a breath and to quiet my mind. And for me, it's about giving more airtime, more presence for what I call spirit.
Yeah.
Because the other 2, when they're in leadership, the scary mind and my busyness of the to-do doesn't provide for a lot of time. So on the hour, I stop and take a breath. I eliminate all those outside distractions. I drop into that quiet place, and I notice what I've been doing and how can I bring this into this next hour. So again, not a psychologist, don't have a Ph.D., but I got my Ph.D. at Sidewalk U.
Street smart you. It's very good.
So Todd, you've talked quite a bit about the filter of fear, and if I look at the U.S. history, particularly the last 100 years, both in industry where we tell people to be afraid of their bad breath or body odor or whatever, or the U.S. government, we have perfected fear to a point as a society that we've exported it around the world. And so when you talk about the principles and practices of the eliminating the personal fear filter, how and what can we be doing as a society to remove that fear filter?
If I understood your question correctly, you're asking how do we do it as an individual that then has its ripple effects out into society, or how do we do it as a society? Yeah, because I think it has to be done in a grassroots kind of a way. Madison Avenue is not going to take kindly to these tactics. It's again the potential for healing, growth, fulfillment, spiritual realization that comes when we fear bust, to make up a word. You've got Ghostbusters, you got fear busters. When we go into the fear and really courageously, honestly assess it. I use the analogy of a kid who's terrified of the boogeyman in the closet. And they're hiding under the covers in bed, and every now and then peeking up over the sheets to make sure that the doorknob isn't turning and the door isn't creaking open. And you ask them, how do they know there's a boogeyman? And they're dumbfounded, right? Well, I just know that I've always been afraid of it. There must be a reason I'm afraid, right? Have you ever seen it? No. Take that kid by the hand, open the door, turn the light on, have them look in every corner. There's no way to continue to believe there's a boogeyman after that. It's in your cells, the awareness that the fear was made up. Again, as Marilyn was saying, there are certain fears and problems that we can resolve just by setting our mind on that beautiful goal of the Olympic gold medal and so forth. Others, just by virtue of a lifetime of practice, early childhood trauma, and the constant reinforcement from society outside, have a deeper hold on us, and we've got to do deeper work. So that's where I think it's not just exposure therapy in the classic sense, which is pretty like roughshod in my estimation, because you don't necessarily know if you're facing the right fear and facing it in the right way. But in the Deconstructing Anxiety program, we have 3 ways of resolving fear conceptually. And then we have different exercises that put those conceptual ways into practice. But each of them has to do with being very, very meticulous, like that kid looking in the closet, to expose every little corner of fear where it's been hiding. Freud had a wonderful phrase. He said something like, if you give one place in town sanctuary, all the thieves will gather there. Meaning, if we hold one part of our mind like as a safe haven from looking at our fear, exposing ourselves to it, all of our problems will gather there, right? We keep them in unconsciousness, and they do their dirty work under the surface. So we have to bring that out into the light. And one of the exercises in Deconstructing Anxiety is called The Alchemist. You're imagining, safely in imagination, moving through the scene of a problem, letting it unfold as if on a movie screen to its ultimate conclusion, then staying there in your imagination for 1 hour, 3 hours, 5 hours, a day, a week, a month, and extending the time interval out to billions and billions of years, or in one person's case, to eons upon eons upon eons. And when we're sitting inside the imaginary experience of our fear that long, discovering that it's not doing anything to us after millions, a shift happens. It's the same shift that happens in any enlightenment experience, any psychotherapeutic healing experience, any release of potential in an Olympic athlete. It's an awareness that fear isn't real, and I am not separate from that which I need and was afraid of not getting. I'm one with it. I'm one with the other person. This country is one with the other country. We're a global humanity.
Wow, Todd. You just shined a big spotlight on why the Olympic Village experience was so powerful.
Mm.
And I thought, you know what? There is no way that you could be in the Olympic Village with all of these isms and countries that are at war with each other. And when I asked the question, how is it we can live in peace with all these differences? And I thought, well, everywhere I walk around, I have respect for no matter who I see. I don't know what country or whether you're a gold medalist or an also ran. And then I'm curious. I'm sitting on the bus next to you on the way to a venue. I'm interested in your story. And I thought, we could have a global Olympic Village if people just walked around and just did the 10-day challenge. Walk around and imagine this is the Olympic Village. This person might be an also ran. They might have even cheated to get there or paid somebody, to make the team. You don't know their story. But if you have respect and curiosity, it could be a global Olympic Village. And to your point of what you just said that made this huge light bulb go off, it's like there is no way that once you have been in the Olympic Village that you could ever believe that we cannot make it as a planet and a species. And so my whole life has come from that, having opened the closet, and looked in there and seen and been and experienced the Olympic Village. So I get it that it was a privilege. And I'm hoping that I'm living in a world now where people can see what I see and experience what I experience, that people are basically good. They basically want to get along. And when you quiet the mind and look, for most of us, at your day-to-day experience, you can see the peace that is. And then we can focus on and create strategies for the challenges that exist. Todd, this has just been terrific. I think you rock.
Takes one to know one. Takes 2 of you to know one. Thank you. Thank you. It's just beautiful what you've said, because in addition, I can imagine that you had this immediate camaraderie with the other Olympians because you've all been through this same very challenging experience, which is a metaphor for the very challenging experience of life we all go through. And when we can see and appreciate that the other person has dealt with their fears and risen above them to whatever degree here or there, we're all driving for the same thing. That creates goodwill and
Yep.
oneness. Yeah.
And for me, the thought was, no, with all of our differences, we're more alike than we are different. And we can explore both of those things. So thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to encourage people, my closing thought today is just, all of these theories and all of these kinds of things from these, really smart, I call you guys scary, smart people because of how you think. For me, it's just like, just do what Olympians do. Just stop, take a breath, exhale, eliminate all of that stuff, quiet this and find that place. And then when you take another breath, you will step into the world. You will be increasing the peace and participating with people around the world who are doing their best to cooperate and get along.
Beautiful.
There's been a lot of requests in the chat, Todd, for just getting to know a bit more about you and your journey. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share. You've talked a few things about your father being a psychotherapist trained by Freud students. You talked about being a skater, but wondering if you'd like to share a bit more about your life's journey and how that's informed the work that you do.
Sure. Who doesn't love to talk about themselves?
And you've got a great story. I loved getting to know you in our conversation. Please share.
I think I was 14 when my path began, and like any adolescent worth her or his salt, began asking all those big existential questions. Why are we here? What's the meaning of life? And what is this thing called suffering? I was very privileged to have a really happy childhood. Thanks, Mom and Dad. Yeah. And it was protected in the way it should be, so that when it came time to face the larger world as an emerging young man, I saw, whoa, they're not all responding to me like I'm the center of their world, and forgive any kind of temper tantrum I might have. Point is that I took these existential questions very, very seriously. I am known to have a whole lot of zeal in my approach to healing and growth. So first, it set me out on a philosophical quest. I tried looking at some philosophers, didn't find answers there. Then I was at college, and anybody who knows, well, most people know about positive psychology. Martin Seligman was one of the founders of that. He was my first psychology professor at University of Pennsylvania, long before positive psychology came into view. And I loved psychology. I was quite thrilled by it, which made my parents happy, of course. Mom was a social worker, by the way, so psychoanalyst, social worker, what chance did I have? But I came to it honestly. It was really quite a passionate pursuit of truth. And eventually, my father was very avant-garde and started getting interested in Eastern philosophy, read certain books by Swami Muktananda and then Fritjof Capra, marrying the Tao of physics with Hinduism and ancient philosophy. And I would hear what he was talking about to some colleagues, and some very interesting phrases like everything is a oneness and all is consciousness. And I didn't understand what they meant, but my antennae sure went up. And I started talking to him, and we had conversations. He was a great man, truly great man. Everybody loved him. And doors opened for him because he was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor in this strange territory called spirituality. So he met Michael Murphy from Esalen Institute, through whom he met Stan Grof. Stan Grof introduced him to Swami Muktananda. He had darshan with Swami. Point is, he took me to a lot of conferences. We went together, read the same things, had great conversation. and opened a lot of doors for me. I was extremely fortunate. Eventually, I discovered A Course in Miracles, very important in my path. Zen Buddhism, very important in my path. And always grounded in a psychological endeavor. Again, thank you, Dad, because I wanted to make it work in life as we lived it. So I had to ground it in a way that would bring relief from my own suffering, these big existential questions. And I am quite zealous, as I said, about finding practical strategies that really work. I'm not content with Hallmark card sayings. I'm not content with even, and this is maybe going to ruffle some feathers in my field, cognitive behavioral therapy when it's limited to thought replacement. Cognitive behavioral therapy also includes exposure therapy, which I think is the only thing that really convinces us there's nothing to be afraid of. In any case, I started working as a private practice psychologist and trying some of these ideas out on clients that were working so well for me. And voila, the Deconstructing Anxiety program emerged.
Mm.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Really appreciate you helping us understand the journey that you've been on and the path you've been on and the journey that is ahead for you. And thank you for the work that you do.
Right back at you both, really. I'm so impressed with what you're doing here. And yeah, let's each of us, everybody listening, everybody speaking to find our own way to peace is the best way to model it and spread the ripple effects and exemplify this possibility in the face of so much seeming evidence to the contrary. World needs it.
Yeah, I mean, one of Marilyn and I have been friends for, I don't know how long now, 15 years or more. And, one of the things that Marilyn has continued to inspire me is that, just through her own experiences in the Olympic Village and seeing that world peace is possible, but understanding that, picking up on your work, that we've got a fear filter. We have a belief that peace isn't possible filter, and it literally can change in a nanosecond.
Mm.
The fear can go away in a nanosecond. World peace, it already exists. Our story that it doesn't exist can go away in a nanosecond. And I really appreciate you bringing your work and your perspective to this conversation today.
Can I share another quote that speaks to that and just thrills me from A Course in Miracles? I'll say the quote and then I'll explain the connection. Only infinite patience yields immediate results. Course in Miracles is brilliant. So it's what you just said. It can change in a nanosecond, immediate results. When we have infinite patience, which is another way of saying when we lose the fear that says, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I have to find a way to get rid of it now. We haven't talked today about how defenses as a strategy to try and take care of fear and preserve fulfillment backfire. But defenses say, for instance, I've got to, through my personal separate will, impose my will on a situation to make the problem the way I want it to be. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, I've got to impose my will to make it the way I want it to be, right? When we relieve ourselves of that, it's a burden, really. That personal agenda, that will, that drive that says, I've got to exert my agency on the environment in front of me and have infinite patience, saying, it's not up to me, right? It's not about my little facet of perspective in this giant diamond that has to be accounted for. Then we have room for the other facets, other people's views. And there's one diamond, right? One view that we're all trying to work toward. Everybody wants the same thing in the end. We need to let go of our fear, have that infinite patience to try and achieve it.
And I have to laugh because when I had my aha, it was like, oh my gosh, we could see peace in my lifetime if people thought, like Olympians. And I got up the next morning, and I'm thinking, all of this efforting stuff and Olympia and, this kind of, that kind of energy toward it. And then when I looked out, I went, so we could see peace in my lifetime. It's like, what's it going to look like? Oh, well, it'll kind of look like this. And, people stop at stop signs and wait in line, and that little line on the highway, mostly people. So I started to see the peace that is. And it really shifted my worldview about what is required. And where I wound up with is paying attention to language and how important it is for us to see the peace that is, which allows us to shift, the fear that comes from all of what is being projected. And then what I tell people, it feels to me like our job is to accelerate the next evolution of peace. The next evolution of peace, because see the peace that is. And I can do that by one breath. I am more peaceful. Therefore, I will affect a little more peace in the world. And through programs like this, we can see how to work at the systemic level of change around the problems that create the fear and the challenge. So again, thank you. Thank you.
I would say, Marilyn, I give you an honorary doctorate. You don't have to worry about the doctorates. You're forging the way for all of us.
Well, I'd like to invite Jim back into the conversation as we close out today's program, but really appreciate the richness of the dialogue we've had today.
Yes.
Me too, guys. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Todd. While you were talking, it reminded me of Dune. If you've seen the movie or read that masterwork by Frank Herbert, fear is the mind killer. When the fear has washed over me, I will remain. And that's another way of putting what you've been speaking about. So thank you for that. I'd like to posit possibly another way of looking at fear, because as you know, fear is embedded in the psyche, not only of humans, but almost every creature we know about. And that fear is actually a very healthy emotion if it's utilized correctly. And so I'd like to open that up as a conversation for a moment, because I think in our culture, fear and many of the negative emotions have been marginalized because they don't feel good. But the reality is that they serve us very well. And I think that one of the problems that we have in our contemporary culture is we're not afraid enough of the right things, like nuclear war. We've been inured about the reality. And when, for example, I speak about it, many people will react against it because they don't want those feelings to come up in their psyche, because it doesn't feel good, right? We're in a culture where everybody has to feel good all the time. And when you don't kind of feel good all the time, there's something kind of wrong, and we either mask it or we denigrate it in some way. So from my vantage point, anxiety, depression, fear, ambivalence are actually healthy emotions if they're responses of the polity, the body politic, us as psychosomatic beings, to stimuli that a healthy organism would feel those fears. Now, the question is sort of what happens once that fear or the anxiety or the depression is beginning to surface. That's sort of a second issue. But I've been sitting here feeling that I wanted to defend the emotion of fear. I want to, because I believe it's healthy. And I believe that the world is not afraid enough of what it is that we're about ready to do to ourselves. We're not afraid enough of the consequences of climate change. We're not afraid enough of the consequences of nuclear war that is creeping up all around us. So it's a two-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, it's what Jung would call a complexio oppositorum. Everything that you've been saying, I completely agree with. And I think the opposite is also true. So I'm just bringing in that opposite, not to negate, but to expand a very complex phenomenon that I think we don't fully understand. I hope I was articulate. I may not have been articulate about that point.
Perfectly. May I respond?
Yeah, please.
Not sure what time we have left. This is crucial, what you're saying. And there is an essential way of distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy fear. I'll say it in a kind of layman's way, if you'll forgive me, first, and then get into some detail. If fear, anxiety, depression, all manifestations of fear, in my way of thinking, is stuck and recycling, it's not healthy.
Yeah.
On the other hand, as you said, it's surfacing in the interest of coming out, metaphorically, of the system, discharging it to make room for a higher awareness, then fear is healthy and it serves that goal of higher awareness. But we don't stay afraid at that point. We have to look at the masters, right? Who, again, accomplish the same thing. I couldn't agree with you more. I meant to say it earlier, so I'm really glad you brought it up, that in your opening, you're bringing us to a necessary awareness of the urgency of the situation. And I couldn't agree more that the denial, the repression, the complacency about these problems, which could wipe us out any moment, is our biggest enemy, right? Our biggest enemy. If we're not aware of the problem or bringing the consciousness, the seriousness of it, we can't do anything about it. But I don't want to leave it there, because fear, I do believe, backfires, creating more tension, more, it locks us into a limited view of things. And so when it's used as a vehicle to say, yep, here's a real situation that needs real attention, then we resolve it's hard because we're using the word in a couple of different ways. This where I'll get more specific in a moment. But if we resolve the fear in that awareness of the urgency of the problem, then we can be as maximally effective. The piece that I think makes it really clear is when we bring in this concept of defensiveness. So here's fear. We slap a defense on it to try and cover it up, keep it away from us. You're absolutely right. Nobody likes talking about it. But as in the boogeyman in the closet example, we have to take that lid off, do the opposite of the defense, to face that fear. No complacency, no repression, no positive thinking that is not taking into consideration the urgency of the situation. Then we can have the discovery that the way we were understanding the situation through fear's filter was distorted. Now we have a more accurate assessment of the situation, making us more effective to deal with it. But if we keep it covered up under defensiveness, that's the problem. Defenses can come in the form of just repressing the awareness completely, or keeping it stuck in an awareness of the problem as this really, really is scary. when we defend it and say it really is this way, rather than let me take a look, assuming I don't know what it's about because I've never let myself look at it. Defenses
Excellent.
start early
Yeah.
in life.
Yeah.
Now we have the chance for something brand new, which I propose is always going to be a more helpful solution. So you're right, both and, not either or. I agree with you completely, Jim. And then if we change the language from fear that's defended against to fear that inspires us to see the reality of the situation and take effective action, that's where we get help.
Let me thank you so much. You have deep insights in this matter, and I think that your last point about not wrapping your fear in denial is critical. You know, I was just reading the other day about the Holocaust and the fact that so many Jews in the 38, 39 didn't leave. And part of the problem was they wouldn't talk about it. It was a kind of verboten to talk because they wanted to keep the normalcy of their world. And we all go through it, all of us. You know, we're going through it right now in the United States today. So I mean, it's a universal mechanism because we want normal, we want stability, unless we're literally forced out of it in compelling ways. And that I wanted to emphasize that because that leads to my final question, and that is the difference in your mind between what you've been saying, let's say, as it pertains to any of us, say Marilyn, in preparing for the Olympics, you're in a normal world, you've got some objectives, but the world is normal, right? Would you change anything you've said today, say to the people in Gaza right now, where the world is not normal and violence is all around? And of course, this is the great brilliance of who was the guy that Man's Search for Meaning? Who wrote Man's Search?
Frankl.
Viktor Frankl. This was the great genius of Viktor Frankl, that in that duress, he was able to find meaning. So, okay, let's put you in Gaza, and you've got to articulate to the people, the Palestinians there that are enduring this genocidal onslaught.
Yeah.
How do they navigate around their fear? What would you say? Would you change anything that you've said today? Or is what you say applicable to all circumstances?
I love these light, fluffy questions. Again, speaking to my heart, and I do talk about Viktor Frankl's work as one example. Gandhi's work is an extraordinary example as well of how, and this is an extreme statement, I'm fully aware, and I don't believe anything less will work or satisfy us or serve the need of the day. And that sentence is, no, I wouldn't change what I said, because we must hold fast to the ideal that freedom from fear, the non-productive kind that recycles, is the only way to healing. Gandhi was asked in the midst of World War II and what Hitler was doing, what would you say? Would you practice nonviolence with Hitler? And he thought about it and thought about it, took a long time to answer, and he finally said, oh, sorry, the question was, would what you're doing, nonviolence, work with Hitler? He thought about it and finally said, not without great sacrifice, which he'd already demonstrated in the search for liberation from Great Britain. So in the midst of, but ultimately it's the only thing that can work, he said. The only thing that can work. Because if we are defending running scared from the enemy, we're reinforcing in our minds that it's an enemy more powerful than us. We can't do anything about it. I'm a victim. Talk about a projection, right? We're living in a, I like to say, three-dimensional, multi-sensory hologram that we're projecting. And that looks very real because it's coming into all the senses and reinforcing it. But it actually starts with what I call the blueprints of fear projected out, like that overlay, that slide filter on top of reality. To get back to your question, if we don't get free from that distorting filter, we can't see a huge number of alternate options for how to handle the situation more effectively. So everybody here is working on a different option than, let's say, our politicians or government officials are using for solving the problem. And in doing so, we're necessarily having a larger picture than the very tight focus, contracted focus of our fear. It's the only way that things can be worked out, I believe.
Yeah.
So Todd, let me just, in terms of Jim, if you don't mind, directly to relate to what you talk about so eloquently about the nuclear threat. I'm wondering, Todd, I believe that giving people more information about the current status and the brink that we're on and creating more fear, some people do that so that we can create more awareness about how the problem. I believe that people are pretty aware, but given the scenarios and all the information that we have, we feel impotent. So what would you say in terms of people who are so passionately committed to increasing awareness, which I think already exists? Seems to me there's something different we need to do right there that will then engage people in being active as opposed to feeling impotent.
Yeah. This is where the principle of oneness is essential. We can feel impotent and like I'm just this big in the face of an infinitely large, uncaring universe or a world that is full of so many problems. And when we resolve our own fear, come to peace, it's not just for ourselves. We model it for other people, and that's a very real phenomenon, but let's not even talk about that. I think that has ripple effects beyond our awareness by a lot. Let's not even talk about that. It makes us more effective to take action, and we become more effective in our speaking. There are, again, Olympic coaches or politicians and so forth that use fear as a strategy, right? To get people to do what they want. And it works to a degree, but with all this horrible backlash. There are others who say, look at Gandhi, look at Frankel, look at Martin Luther King. If I demonstrate that your fear tactics can't scare me, I end up winning the day. And like Gandhi said, not without considerable sacrifice. We're not blind or repressing the blind to or repressing the reality of the situation, but the stakes are that high. Our affairs are now soul-sized. As Christopher Fry would say, we've got to meet the situation in the most effective way. And I propose fear does not offer that. Fear and defense against fear. It's primarily the defense that's the problem. Lay down our arms, practice the kind of Gandhi incentivized an entire nation to march into the beating batons of the British police, accept that punishment to the point where the journalist that was reporting on it said, Great Britain, king of the world, has lost its moral superiority this day. India has won the day, right? That's a radical definition of how to meet our world problems. And in the end, I propose everything else is going to recycle. Fear leads to defense. Defense leads to fear. Never ends. It never ends. We've got to do something different.
Let me just raise one other point, which I think ties things together in a way I'd love to have you comment on. And that is that the dynamic that you're speaking to of seeing it, reality for what it is, what Mr. Gorbachev would say, looking at reality ruthlessly, and then leaving, when the fear then recedes and you do what you know you need to do, that not only changes you, it changes the objective reality. And that's, I think, a really important point to emphasize, that this is not simply an interior self-reflective process. And I think, Marilyn, you're exhibit A, that you went through this process internally, and this is Viktor Frankl. He was able to change his objective reality in Auschwitz because he was clear that this was ultimately about a search for meaning.
Yeah.
And I think we should all bear that in mind as we think about, a world out of control and Gaza and all these other aspects of reality that are sort of tearing us asunder. It's our capacity actually to maintain deepening coherence in that chaos that actually shapes the chaos itself. There's all kinds of stories of people that are at war, and the soldiers who think they're going to get shot. Many times it's the soldiers that feel I'm okay. I can take that hill. I can do X or I can do Y, and they proceed boldly beyond their fear, that they're actually shaping the objective reality out there. So I would love to have you comment on that, and then I know we have to bring this to a close, Tom. But this has been so rich, Todd. You're a wellspring of deep insights.
I want to say one thing to your comment right there, was that you brought forth something that worked for me, which is, in training for 1980, the reality did not change. I could not physically train, and I was endeavoring to compete at the Olympic level in 5 events, and everybody else was training. What I did in that moment, in that breath, is I focused on a deeper reality, which was my truth and my reality. So I think that that's a lot of what we're talking about, is bringing us back to, does the reality around us change? Maybe not, maybe it does, but there is a deeper reality. And when you focus on your deeper reality, then you behave from that place, and you create a shift that you are endeavoring.
Yeah, but the subjective world and the objective world are not distinct.
Right.
Yeah, your subjective reality, whatever it is that you went through, ended up shape-shifting the objective world.
Yes.
Because you ended up in the Olympics.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would like to add an example, and I think we all have examples from our own lives. Somebody help me with the details. There was in the midst of some war on Christmas Eve. Yes. I don't know if it was World War II or not. They started singing Christmas songs and opposing sides. World War I started to lay down their arms. And I saw a bit of a movie on it once. It was well done because it showed how scary it was to dare to trust the other side. And yet they were both singing their Christmas carols, and they were both desperate for connection and love. And what happened was they did overcome their fear and unite in this higher expression of goodwill. And then their commanding officer said, no, go back. And it's about shape-shifting, right? The reality of the war right there changed completely according to their internal decisions. Then again, external fear happened, external source of fear. It's still a decision. Do we buy into that or not?
Yeah.
And then the reality shifted again. I never thought to use that example before, but it's a good one, We can literally see it happens in everyday transactions. We're having a wonderful conversation with someone, and there's all this flow and energy and connection. And then somebody says something that the first person interprets as a slight, all of a sudden, there's this pall that comes over the scene, right? It's literally cast in a dark hue. Did the reality out there change? Are these two different people than you thought a moment ago? You know, there's that wonderful story in the Talmud, a scene in hell. Everybody's seated in front of a banquet table with all the most wonderful food you could imagine in the greatest abundance you could want. How is that hell? Because everybody has a fork longer than their arms, so they can't get the darn food in their mouths. Scene of heaven, same banquet table, same abundance of wonderful food, same long forks, this time feeding each other. And that's not a Hallmark card, it's a demonstration of a shift in perception that started from within.
Right.
You're not even available to seeing these higher solutions when we're caught up in fear.
Brilliant. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Todd. Tom, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, I'm listening to this conversation and your question, Jim, about the people in Gaza. Back in 2020, I was invited to put together a retreat for the Vatican on nonviolence, and I interviewed a variety of people within the Catholic Church around the world. And one of the women I interviewed was a Christian woman, Palestinian, that was living in the way she described it, living in hell. She was confined to her home. She anytime she went out, she was, had to go through a frisking exercise by the military, and she said, "I hate these people." And yet she quickly followed it up by saying, "My hating them is self-administered poison."
Mm.
And she completely shape-shifted her reality of the life that she was living, and said, we're all connected, we're all one. I love these people.
Mm.
And it was just it was a 45-minute interview I had with her, and she had me in tears, just talking about the harsh reality of her life, and yet how she viewed the reality of her life and the story that she created. And she wasn't allowing the fear to consume her. She wasn't allowing the fear to dominate her daily activities that were incredibly oppressive. She felt like she was living in prison. And yet she made the life that she made from it. And so that, to your question, that I would just share that as an example of what's possible.
Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. It made me think of Helen Keller.
Absolutely.
Here this woman was deaf, dumb, and blind. If anybody had a excuse, if that's the right word, or a reason for self-pity and the range of negative emotions that a handicap would bring, and she powered right through it and became Helen Keller, a woman that we all love and admire the world over.
Yes.
So I mean, that's a very powerful story, and it's a good way to end our week on the eve of Peace Day tomorrow.
Yes.
I'm delighted. We'll continue next week, and sorry we're going to miss you, Jim, with your travels, but we'll start on Monday with the role that science and technology have to play in enabling world peace.
Good. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Marilyn. You inspire us all. Todd, you've been brilliant. Thank you so much. You can join Todd and Marilyn and Tom in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You received it in your Zoom reminders for today. Enjoy your weekend. Remember Peace Day on the 21st. And we'll see you all again on Monday. Bye for now.
Thank you all.